Coincidental.
Okay, hey everyone. My name is Chris Rodkey, and welcome to the Radical Theology Q&A session with Tad. We got J.L. Pearl and Jordan and some other guests here, and some people might be popping in and out. And I'm going to be popping in and out, but I appreciate everybody sending in all of the questions. And Jordan, thank you for putting this together. And I'm going to introduce Tad, whose new book is really good, Against. I think it's one of the better books I've read recently about our current political situation. And I think it's very readable. I think it's not terribly academic, and I think more people should read it. So, Tad, I'm going to hand it to you and tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me in and having this idea in the first place. I do really appreciate it. Hi, I'm Tad DeLay, and I wrote this book kind of out of a series of questions that I kept getting kind of after the 2016 election. You know, like the why won't they believe in climate science? What's the deal with evangelicals? Thinking conversion therapy is okay. Like, why do they find the widely popular act of sex to be such a threat? Like, those kind of like standard things. And then I'm like at the same time doing like a lot more speaking on some of my previous work, and I'm kind of noticing the certain patterns that you guys probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Like when people tell you that they're asking certain questions and reading certain things, you can kind of have a sense of where that person might be kind of like 6 months down the road based on how long they've been asking those same question, right? Like there seems to be, and I don't mean that like in a bad way, like there's kind of like a sense of, it's actually kind of good, I think, in a way that there's kind of a familiarity to these types of patterns, the ways that people process this information. And I definitely noticed that with myself. But really, I had also just kind of, I had a lot of questions that I grew up in Baptist and evangelical churches, and I was a good Christian kid. I was a rule follower. I loved every minute of it. I was like super involved in my youth group. I did the internships. I thought I was going to be a minister for a while. That got derailed when it became increasingly clear that doing any sort of academic theology or philosophy was not going to be very welcome. I had a few particularly nasty incidents of kind of becoming ostracized from certain churches that I was working in, just because I either had personality clashes or like doctrinal things or personality clashes that were disguised as doctrinal things, you know, the way that it goes, right? And I really had this conviction that I'm really into philosophy and theology, but I don't want to do that in a situation that requires me to lie for a paycheck. And so I kind of decided that the ministry route was not going to be the way for me, but especially not like in that context of the Bible Belt that I was coming out of. So I ended up moving to Los Angeles and studying theology, but through it all, I've kind of, I picked up so many different pieces to my background. I think over the last, spending basically all of my 20s and early 30s in Los Angeles, and then moving in the last few years to Denver. But I've never really kind of done like a deep dive on where all of that comes from, like where all of that stuff that I was so invested in as a kid, where does it come from? Like one example I always use is I grew up like in a very working class family that like nevertheless put a big priority on us going to a Christian school, right? So we went scholarship to these Christian schools, and I was vaguely aware, especially in Little Rock, that there was this whole Central High integration thing with like Eisenhower and the 101st Airborne that happened forever ago. All of this like really, really crazy background stuff. And like there was a point where they just shut down the school system for an entire year, right? This happened like throughout the South and various locales. And that's where we get the private school coming out of that, right? And so I had these, the sense that a lot of this stuff, like I knew bits and pieces of it, but I didn't know like the full story, right? And so there was just a kind of a questions like that kept coming up that I wanted to explore more. And so I figured, why not make a book out of it, right? Like this seems to be like questions that I'm getting a lot as a speaker, as an author, and there seems to be some sort of appetite out there for understanding the sort of complex interconnected roles that these weird little figures and trends and booklets, and then like think tanks and presidential administrations, they all kind of like bounce and resonate around. And so, yeah, I wanted to explore that, and as much as a personal project as it was like a sort of an academic project.
So Tad, I wanted to ask, given that we are the Radical Theology Discussion Forum hosting this, given your background and your kind of false start on a path toward ministry in particular, what would you articulate as your relationship to theology in general? And then more specifically, how about radical theology?
Yeah, so that's definitely changed quite a bit just in the last couple of years, right? So I think that when I published my first book, God is Unconscious, in 2015, that was in the wake of like just a crazy time in life with like a very sudden divorce and a lot of rethinking a lot of things. And at that point, I was very kind of engaged in this radical theology, sort of post-theistic discussion, right? And it's still like, that's an interesting conversation to me, right? But I don't find myself to be a theist at all anymore. And then kind of the further I've gotten from, I also finished my doctorate in 2016, about the same time that I released my second book. And in that kind of stew, I guess, of interest, I started kind of considering myself a little bit less of a theologian altogether. Just kind of, I get just the content of what I was teaching, what I was interested in. It was a lot of philosophy and a little bit of religious studies, and it was almost no theology, right? When I was in Los Angeles, I was teaching a little bit of theology, and I did a lot of theology for my doctorate, and just my life circumstances has kind of taken me away from that. But at the same time, these things keep happening in the world that draw my attention to, like, I don't know, climate change or fascism studies, and things that kind of fit within certain realms of political philosophy more than they do into theology or even radical theology. So I guess it's a long-winded way of me to say that I'm still very interested in these discourses, right? I still consider myself a theologian, at least to some degree, and I'm still very interested in the types of discussions that go on in these circles. But I think that in the same way that my theism has kind of ebbed and flowed, I think my interest in the discourse that generally kind of fits under the rubric of radical theology has sort of flowed in an interesting way as well. And yet I find myself like very close friends with so many people in this world, and like have a lot of, I think, ideological affinities that are shared across the spectrum. So, yeah.
Thanks.
So when I'm thinking about this sort of tense relationship you have, I think a lot about the style of discourse that you do have. If it's not a theological discourse, it seems to be this sort of socially engaged psychoanalytic discourse. And so I thought we have a lot of questions in here about evangelicalism and about religion and about politics and things along those lines. But before we got there, what I thought might be good would be to start with some questions just around the notion of desire, which seems to be at the heart of your entire project. That when you're looking at white evangelicalism in particular, you're specifically looking at the way in which that group desires. So maybe just to start off, so we got a question here. So we asked for some submissions from questions from folks. Preston Price sent in a question, a really simple one, but always as it is with these sorts of questions, the shorter it is, the harder it is. So he asked, why do humans desire? And so maybe we can use that as a way of just opening up the question. What do you mean when you say desire, and how does it relate to the political questions that you're trying to ask and answer here?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's such a, exactly. Right. Like it's a very simple question, and then like so many layers to it. When I say desire, I kind of think, okay, so the two things that I want to kind of say up right off the bat. Psychoanalytically speaking, we can differentiate desire that is biological, right? Like I have a desire for food. I also have desires that are cultural, that are laid on top of that, right? Like I have the desire for sushi, right? Like so, and like there's a difference between the biological side and the cultural side, right? Like the desire is not one thing. I've been working through this a lot with my in my classes recently, because I'm kind of working from something that's like, I don't really want to call it Buddhist, but there's a little bit of like this concept of like attachment as like the thing that creates the suffering, right? Like, so desire is not like a bad thing, but it generates the conditions under which you suffer, right? So you have like, on the one hand, you have like this Buddhist side to it, and then you have this Lacanian side that says never give ground on your desire, right? Like never, in the sense of like, don't submit your desire to another's desire, right? And that's an interesting message that is probably very necessary in a lot of circumstances, right? But a lot of people also have really shitty desires, right? And desires that should not be acted on, and desires that probably should be repressed, right? And so like we can kind of think of, okay, so like the difference between the biological and the cultural type of desire in the first place. And then we can think of desire as something that is creating attachments that lead to suffering, that lead to problems, right? Versus trying to liberate desire and not repress that desire and submit that desire to a big other, right? And then sort of even more problematically, I don't think that I've been working through this with my shrink a lot actually recently. I don't think that we all mean the same thing when we kind of talk about desire, right? Like we think of like desire as like wanting something, right? The psychoanalytic theory kind of works from the assumption that we desire objects, but like what we actually enjoy is the chase of the object, right? Like getting the object actually ceases desire, right? So when we say we desire something, are we desiring an object? Are we desiring an idea? Are we desiring the chase that never quite gets there? What about desire as a way to, like when I desire and I fantasize about something, perhaps it's because I'm dissatisfied with something right now, right? So desire can be a way to draw a distance between where I am and where I would like to be, right? But maybe if I got to where I would like to be, I would actually be even more unsatisfied, right? So desire is the engine. It's driving the motion, right? But it's also driving the dissatisfaction. And I don't think that we ever fully understand our desires. I guess this is one way to kind of maybe land this plane. I think thinking that we understand what we want is always at least a bit of a trap.
I was talking with somebody recently about your book in our parents' generation. Somebody who was kind of invested in the outcomes of the counterculture. And she was really concerned about the way I, parroting you, was using the term desire. Because for her, kind of the feminist battle of that generation was that desire is good, desire is okay, we need to trust our bodies, we need to not kind of sublimate everything and kind of repress and go back into a 1950s desireless cultural condition, right? We need to affirm our desires, and those are good. And so she was wondering about distinguishing between desire and something like addiction or obsession, where it's a desire turned back on itself and the addiction is trying to kill you. I was just wondering if you might kind of find it useful to make those kinds of distinctions, or if you're holding on to desire full stop, kind of in a strong way for some kind of strategic reason.
Well, one thing that my framework sort of would say that the desire is a drive that there is no day or night to, right? Like we are desiring constantly, right? So it's not a matter to me of curtailing desire, right? We simply desire a new object, right? And I think it's helpful to think of that as a like desire as being the primary state, right? So sometimes I repeat this axiom that I sort of copied in a little bit of a way. I copied from Todd McGowan, but this idea that we're not subjects who desire to know, we're subjects who desire full stop. And occasionally that attaches to desire for knowledge, and that's a great thing. When that happens, I tell my students, like, cultivate that, right? Like that's a precious thing when you occasionally desire to know something, but it's not like a natural thing. I could be desiring like a hamburger or sex or sleep or something like that the next minute, right? So on this, like linking this to addiction, right? Like one way to think about this is this axiom again, that we don't desire the object, right? Like we desire the pursuit of the object, right? Like, so if I'm addicted to something, it's like the reason that I'm not going to stop being addicted to it is because I enjoy the rush of getting what I want, the pursuit of it, the thinking about it, the finally getting it, the coming down, even maybe the shame of it, and then the cycle starts again, right? Like it's that whole apparatus that is appealing, not just the one thing. But also, I heard one of my friend, I think some of you guys know Chris Nelson as well. Like he recently said something to the effect of, he's a really great podcast discussion out that came out just a couple weeks ago, where he talked about like clients who are addicts will often articulate their desire in terms of I want to want again, right? Like that. I mean, that's kind of like the baseline level of desiring nothing, right? Is I want to be able to be excited about caring about something again, right? And so that to me is kind of one way of thinking about what we're talking about when we talk about desire. It's a persistent force, and actually we're only talking about repressing and redirecting. We're not talking about killing desire, because killing desire is what you get with addiction. It's what you get with intense depression. That is dangerous behavior, right? Or like a dangerous state to sit in for too long. Right? Does that get at like decently at what you're kind of thinking there?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for whatever it's worth, I went to high school with Chris.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Yeah. No. I love that idea of like I want to want again, because I think all of us kind of have had those moments where, for one reason or another, like it's I don't think you can kind of live too far into your 20s without kind of having those moments of understanding what it means to have the desire to stop, right?
So you talk a lot about desire, but what I think one of the things that sets the methodology of your book apart is that you are quite explicit that although you're talking about desire, you're not going to focus on what people say they believe or what they say they desire. And instead, you're going to focus on actions as evidence of desire, as you put it. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that methodology, about the sort of maybe the risks of reading against the grain. And we also have one question that was asked in relation to this. This is Kurt Kananen. Writes, I've been using this in a research project about abuse within white evangelical churches. I'm wondering if you have had any insight into how the role of the usually white male pastorate functions to foster spiritual abuse. So maybe a broader question about reading actions, and then a more specific question about the way that this can contribute to spiritual abuse.
Yeah, well, okay. So, like on the one hand, when I think it's very important to listen to justifications if we're trying to analyze something, but to understand that those are always telling us the truth in disguise, right? Like in a sense that when, for example, I write kind of early on in the introduction, like some people find use of like Babington's quadrilateral to talk about evangelicalism, and, which is what is it like crucicentrism and activism and biblicism, and like there's one other, what is it, like conversion, right? And that tells you something, right? But like what does the cross or activism or biblicism tell you about it? It tells you about like being like an elect people who want to express a type of hegemony, right? Like it's telling you the truth, but it's in disguise, right? There's certain limits to how much that actually gives you. So I think it's helpful to kind of listen to what people tell you, only because people are telling you the truth all day long in like an inverted form, right? Like when an evangelical tells me that actually they don't want any of these things that I say that they want, like they don't actually want to like kill off everything in sight, destroy everything, exert control, reinforce some sort of like Victorian era patriarchy or something like that. Like I that's interesting to me insofar as they already kind of know that that's probably true, and they're already starting to exert energy to say otherwise, right? Which tells me that they are actually invested enough in that worldview and in making things such and such a way as what I'm describing, that instead of saying, yes, that's messed up, they're going to say, no, that's not true, right? And those are two very different messages, right? So I mean, I think that like a lot of my thesis is that white evangelicalism is a reaction to advancements made by people of color, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of a thread throughout my book, is that you can't really talk about white evangelicalism today unless you talk about the string of events running from, in some senses, the Civil War and Reconstruction, but especially Brown versus Board of Education, through civil rights, through kind of like the Reaganite reaction to all of that. But also, in addition to this overt racism, like there is this like this deep misogyny, right? Like this desire for order. This is what Corey Robin, the political theorist, says is the defining feature of the conservative imagination. It's not, you know, less taxes or a less invasive government. The defining feature is a desire for hierarchy, right? And so that works with the racism, but it also works with the patriarchy as well, right? And so we live in a world that like kind of asks us to think of like maybe the evangelicals is different than the Republicans, maybe not so much, but definitely ask us to think of like the racist version of conservatism as different than the like esoteric, thoughtful version of it. It's all like there's like a psychology to it though, right? Like there's a deep enjoyment and security taken in hierarchy, and when we kind of recognize that desire for hierarchy, and expressions of hegemony, expressions of power, conforming the world to the way that you want it, then it makes really good sense why, like, if you, of course, if you're going to like a complementarian church, of course you're going to run into that kind of abusive character that wants to shape the world to his will, right? He's very committed to the idea that women are second-class citizens, and like why would you not find abuse in that situation? It would be very, very weird to not find people overtly preaching that women are second class to also treat women as second class, right? Like, so I don't know. I don't know to what extent that gets at all of it. I remember reading that question and think that there's a lot going on there, and but hopefully that helps it at least a little bit. I would highly recommend Corey Robin's The Reactionary Mind for further reading on that idea of hierarchy.
So you have this sort of counter reading. So you listen to the justification, but you find the truth sort of buried in there. So I'm interested in the sort of explosion of this language of triggering the lib that you'll see on the internet, where what it seems to be there that there's something interestingly different going on, which is that the desire is directly expressing itself. This is sadism, and it is going to express itself as sadism. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that sort of the triggered lib in that whole.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I think is interesting about that is the way that Jacques Lacan thinks about sadism and masochism, but sadism in particular, is that he says it kind of explicitly in Seminar 10 at some point. The object of sadism is not to hurt the other, right? Like, you don't you know, if you're enjoying sadism with like in a consensual sexual relationship, you're not actually trying to harm your partner, right? Like, his idea was like there's a type of libidinal enjoyment in producing anxiety, right? Like, so it's not you're actually trying to hurt someone else. It's the inducement of a type of anxiety. I think that's exactly what you get with this like triggering the libs language, right? You have somebody who knows has some sort of inferiority complex, kind of knows that they're wrong, kind of knows that they're kind of a jerk, and the way that they can feel powerful is to induce anxiety, right? To poke at it, right? And to try to get a rise out of somebody else, right? And to me, that suggests a deeper desire for the masochistic side of things, right? Like, I think that they are enjoying not liking themselves that much, right? And that's precisely why they need to induce anxiety in somebody else. But I think of that all through the lens of triggering anxiety, not actually trying to trigger pain.
So on this point about kind of desires that are being expressed almost against the will of the person who's describing their behavior or their beliefs to you, Dave Carnish has a question about how you might help people to actually get their true desires back into view, get a more honest look at what their real desire actually is, and what might the role of the fool be in that.
I think that's a better question for a therapist, but like as far as I can venture, I mean, so the question of like aligning one's desires with something close to what you can call your own desire. All right. First off, I need to say that I'm not convinced that there is such a thing as like an authentic self or an authentic desire. I think that's probably kind of a dead end to kind of go to. But in as much as there is something close to an authentic desire that we have, we end up asking, what does the other desire, right? Like, what does my boss desire? What does my partner desire? Like, what will my friends think of me? In my case, like a big thing is like, what will my readers think of me, right? Like, so I had to have like several sessions right before my book launched of like kind of going through, what if people don't like it, right? Like, and I want people to like it, right? And, you know, and my shrink is kind of like asking me questions like, why is it that you desire to have people like what you put out there, right? Because if you wrote a book that is like half the people you're describing, like what they want you to write, you would actually not really like that book very much, right? But we nevertheless trap ourselves by kind of asking this question, right? Like, what does the other want of me, right? And this is Lacan's like kind of like anxiety question, like square one, right? Is the other asks, what do you want, and you don't quite know, and you're also asking, what does the other want, and maybe the other doesn't know, or the other doesn't answer, or you can't figure out what the other wants. And it's this dynamic between one and the other, or between, if I'm talking about like a God, like maybe just me and my imaginary friend that doesn't actually exist and isn't giving me the answers because it doesn't exist, right? But like maybe to me, I feel a lot of anxiety trying to ask that question, like, what does the other want? No answer returns. And so I need to narcissistically project what I think the other wants, which is also what we do like in relationships, right? Like right before things go bad and like we have a fight about things, right? Because like you're like trying to project what you think the other wants instead of actually being able to engage that, right? I feel like I'm rabbit trailing a little bit here, so feel free to pull me back into kind of where you were going with that if you would like. But did you have like another direction that you wanted to hit with that?
Yeah, I mean, so you've described the desire at the root of evangelicalism as basically death and destruction, right?
Yes, sort of, right? I mean, like I say that kind of as a joke, but like kind of seriously, like if we just read desires by like what are they actually doing, it looks like they're committed to like concentration camps and to like ripping up the Paris Accord, right? It really looks like I could see it evolving into a more stridently xenophobic faith, like once the mass climate migrations really pick up, right? So I kind of say it as a kind of like a grim joke, but I do actually kind of mean that I do actually think that the destruction and hierarchy is something that is a primary drive.
Sure. I mean, and back to this question from before about the relationship between desire and behavior. Behaviorally, white evangelicalism it's a death cult. I mean, pretty explicitly. And so, you know, I have to ask you the big question, which is, how do we save the world? Right? If this is what's really going on at the root of white evangelicalism, how do we direct it? How do we redirect it? How do we stop it? How do we defeat it if it can't be reasoned away?
Yeah, that I'm kind of skeptical on, right? And the part of the problem is that we're like white evangelicalism, I think, is far and away the most dangerous faith expression in the world today. I also think the Republican Party is the most dangerous organization in the world, right? But there are other things that are very close and that could kind of, overtake them in time, right? Like it seems completely possible to me that there's a more overtly xenophobic faith around the corner once the changes start hitting, right? We're already kind of seeing other places in the world start to overtake us in carbon emissions and stuff like that, right? Like it wouldn't take that much of an economic crunch for us to kind of fall like way back behind like China's emissions, for example, or something like that. I mean, can it be defeated? Well, it can't be defeated in the sense that we're talking about some combination of how humans are. I don't want to say human nature. I've kind of slipped up in a few recent podcasts and said the word human nature because I'm also not convinced that there's any such thing, right? I think it's kind of a naive idea. But there is some sort of libidinal something like maybe a nature to us. I think we have something like a death drive, not only for like self-destruction, but for hurting others. It seems to me that like I see that expression. But I'm also like a Marxian materialist on the other side, right? Like, so there's this balance of like, there's the Freudian like impulses to get things and destroy things. And then there's the Marxian axiom of like, it's never your consciousness creating your social being, it's your social being creating your consciousness. And so there seems to be some hope that like there's no clear reason why we need to destroy the world if we had different relations of production, right? Like something like a socialism. But also we have like a once in a generation or maybe once in a century chance to do something like in this next election, and we're probably not going to take any sort of really positive direction, right? So I don't know that chance is going to come around again, right? I also kind of think that however bad the changes are that we're about to face, they're going to feel fairly normal for most of our descendants, right? 4 degrees is not going to feel significantly different than 3.9 degrees, right? In a world with 200 million refugees by 2050 is not going to feel a lot different than a world of like 20 million refugees fleeing civil wars right now, right? And like so there's kind of that aspect. And as far as like how do we change that, I feel kind of skeptical about it, but like I can't not teach and write and research and have those conversations, right? Like when I talk to students about especially something like climate change, it's one of those cases where literally like what you can do is like stop worrying about recycling. So I mean that's good, like do that, but what you can do is have lots of conversations, right? Like have conversations every chance you get, because that's the only hope, is that we're gonna like start to build some sort of movement, right? And I don't think that that's completely naive either, because we actually have seen just in like the last year and a half, we've seen like a nearly 10-point swing in the amount of people that say that this is a serious crisis that we're dealing with, right? So to me, it does seem that actual conversations and media exposure actually do have some sort of effect. I don't want to be nihilistic about that. But we need to kind of keep that in check with the idea that capitalism will kill us. If we stay capitalist, like we're done, right? It's brought us to the brink of catastrophe in 0.1% of our history, right? So we can't do that for too much longer, and we need to have those conversations to kind of think through how to get past that.
So on this point about the danger of evangelicalism, you talk in the book about how evangelicalism is kind of hierarchical and specifically racist first, and that the Christianity of it is an improvisation after the fact. Could you talk a bit about the relationship between evangelicalism and Christianity?
Yeah, I do. So that's another thing. I didn't quite set out to make that thesis, and I just couldn't find, like, anywhere I'm looking after the Civil War, you start to find all of the racism that goes like just barely underground, right? Like all of a sudden, all the Supreme Court cases find other things to talk about than skin color, right? Like all of a sudden they're talking about literacy or some other thing that can kind of serve as a proxy, right? You find characters like one of my favorite examples is just like, okay, so basically you find anywhere after the Civil War up until like at least the 50s and maybe kind of to the present day, anytime you're finding some sort of conservative coalition, you'll find like on the one hand the overt like good old like white Southern racism just kind of like out in the open, right? You'll find that on the one hand. You'll find the Christian Calvinist, the sort of committed to giving some sort of ideological infrastructure on the one hand. And then you'll also find, especially starting like 40s, 50s, you start finding very consistent libertarian agendas kind of working in that, right? So you always find like at least 2, if not all 3 of those kind of working in concert, right? And my sense was that when I'm looking at, for example, the Scopes monkey trial, and someone asked me like, why don't evangelicals believe in science? Like, like they seem to believe in medicine for the most part, but like they don't believe in evolution, and all of modern medicine is based on evolution. So like what gives? And you go back and you kind of look at like the change that happened from like Charles Darwin releasing his book in 59 up through like the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And what you find is that the Scopes monkey trial happens like 3 years after the height of lynching, right? Like it happens in the same decade when they are putting up all of those Civil War monuments that we're having discussions about. After the Scopes monkey trial, one man said, the Northerners are stepping into our shield of orthodoxy. They're going to steal the minds of our children. I'm going to start a college. And that college is Bob Jones University, right? Which is like the stalwart of like the religious right and like all of those debates about abortion and interracial interracial dating and like all kinds of messed up stuff like later that century literally starts out of like debates about evolution that are happening at the same time as like just kind of like a way to not have a conversation about race is a I mean, like even the Scopes monkey trial, like transcript, like the way that it comes up, it's very clear that they're trying to draw these racist parallels between like African Americans and like, you know, just like these really super grotesque old school racist things about evolution and like phrenology and stuff like that, right? So like all of these things are these are all covers, right? Like all of these key beliefs are covering over because they know damn well that they can't like say this out in the open, at least not in public. They can say it like when they're just around other people like them, but they can't have these conversations out in the open in public anymore. So they have to debate things like let's say like by the 40s it's birth control and anti-communism and sex ed and like unions and stuff like that, and that too is a very important, like it's an important thing on their own, right? Like they're capitalists, so like they need to oppose unions. But when you're talking about like beating down the working class, you're also, there's a racialized code to that as well, right? And so you might be talking about unions, but really you're talking about black workers, right? Or you might be talking about sex ed in school being bad, but what you're really talking about is interracial dating, right? And then these sort of things come up over and over again. You cannot read the history of evangelicalism, even specifically as an anti-communist or reactionary movement, however we want to do it. And those are important things to kind of tackle on their own right. But you can't read any of this without coming up with the anti-black theme over and over and over again. And at some points, the anti-Semitism is more pronounced as well. That kind of seems to go in more ebbs and flows. But the anti-blackness is a very, very consistent theme, I think, throughout.
One of the things that I think was most shocking and in your book was in your discussion of the Scopes monkey trial. You have this incredible quote. So you have this idea of this rejection of descent from monkeys, and the quote is, "Not even from American monkeys, but from old world monkeys."
Yeah. That's it, right? Like he's talking about Africa, right? He's just putting it right out in the open, right? He's making that connection. And everybody in the courtroom is laughing in that transcript. Everybody knows exactly what's being said. And everybody knows that like lynching is happening and like all of this other stuff is going on. But we're going to make it about like, you know, monkeys and like a family Bible having to like have a family tree that goes back to gorillas at some point, or, you know, whatever else that he's kind of complaining about. Yeah. Thanks for catching that. That's a really great example, I think.
So this reminds me actually of a theme that runs throughout your book, which is that because you're doing these sort of counter readings, there are a lot of really interesting, strange connections. So you claim, for example, that biblical literalism is, quote, rooted in anti-Blackness. You treat abortion rather than in the chapter on sexuality. You treat it in your chapter on education. So I was wondering if you could talk about a couple of these sort of strange placements, sort of flowing from what you were just saying.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the guy's name is that that I'm indebted to on the abortion. Hold on, it's gonna come to me in a second. I'm gonna look it up while I talk about this other thing. The argument about literalism is indebted to Mark Knoll, of course, right? And the argument about abortion is indebted to Randall Balmer. So Mark Knoll makes this case that I don't know that this is 100% airtight, but it makes enough sense that I think that I'm willing to vouch for this as well. Like definitely enough to put in a book, right? I don't want to say that there's never been like any type of literalism before the Civil War, and I don't think that Knoll would make that case either. But literalism only makes sense in a given time period, right? You have to have Luther, for example, we see like in the time that he's writing, literacy goes from like something like 5% to like 25%, like in the span of like a generation, right? And that's because they had more than average, like way more than average printing presses in that Germanic territory, right? Most of Europe had like printing presses in just the big cities. Germany basically had them in every pretty small, like mid-sized village even. So once you get printing presses, you get cheaper books. And for the longest time in history, books were basically they were correlated to how much wheat we produced, right? If you had more wheat, you could have people who didn't work, and those people could be monks, and then monks could copy books, right? Once you get the printing press, you can start to have kind of more normalized market forces, an increase in literacy, but nobody would have appealed like before the printing press. It just doesn't make sense to appeal to what the Bible says. First off, nobody can read the Bible. Maybe our whole town doesn't have a Bible. Not even the priest can read the Bible until the Vatican does some of their reforms kind of in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, right? You remember like they actually had to get to a point where they said, we want to make sure that priests can read, right? Because it was normal to not be able to read. So here we're talking about somewhere between like the 1500s and 1850 already, right? And you kind of get you got like lots of early like kind of colonial America initiatives to kind of push literacy so that people can read the Bible. But Mark Nolman kind of makes like a really good case that like you start to see these specific arguments of like, what does the Bible say kind of emerge in response to what do we think about the slave situation, right? It's not like they didn't know it was terrible. Like there was no sense in which they just had a different mind back then, right? Like they knew what they were doing was evil, and they had to find ways to justify it. So like I have a few different characters cited in the book like as examples, because you find on the one hand the argument of like just what the Bible says, right? Like the Bible says the slavery, and we're not going to think about the differences between ancient wartime slavery and modern like chattel slavery, right? So you have like that argument, and then you also have like these other arguments that are like, well, this is a slippery slope to like communism, because communism and socialism are popping up at that time as well, right? So you have again like even in the Civil War period, you have preachers kind of saying, oh, the Bible seems to say this is okay, and like it never says it's bad, but like, hey, if we go down this road, like where are we going to stop at communism, right? So like there's that aspect of kind of Noel's argument. Randall Balmer is this, I believe he was I can't remember where he teaches, somewhere like Dartmouth or somewhere out there on the East Coast. And he, a few years ago, published a really widely disseminated article in Politico called The Real Origins of the Religious Right. And I think a lot of people read that, and he kind of makes this opening case that the religious right had its grounding less in terms of abortion, and that like actually it was about school segregation. So he kind of traces out this rudimentary history. He ends up making this case more emphatically in a book called trying to remember what the book is called, Thy Kingdom Come. He has a whole chapter on this, where back in the 90s he would actually go to these conferences with like the Heritage Foundation. Paul Weyrich once said, Paul Weyrich, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, or co-founder, once kind of made an offhand comment at some conference for old religious right leaders, where he kind of says, hey, remember, we got together and started off because of school segregation, not because of abortion, right? And Balmer like chases him down afterwards and like has to say like, what was that about? And Weyrich kind of he explains this whole history of like basically trying to galvanize a right-wing movement for years around school prayer, school integration, tax credits for private schools once the South started integrating, right? And basically like all of these early conservative think tanks are starting at this time, and some of them are more on like libertarian angle, some are more on like overt race angle, some are on like religious angle, but they're trying like kind of different things. They're learning how to deploy money within politics. And Weyrich is trying to build this coalition around school segregation, and it's just not taking. And then he kind of said that, yeah, basically he said, and then Balmer checked this out with basically all of the living guard of the old religious right, and everybody confirms it to him. The story goes that literally just on some conference call, they don't even remember when exactly, they think it was 1978, they don't remember who, they don't remember what month, they don't remember what else they were talking about, but somebody kind of says like, have you thought about like organizing around abortion, right? And there had been this like nascent anti-sex ed, largely Catholic movement like against abortion rights up to that time, but it wasn't really a conservative Protestant thing, right? Even the former head of the Southern Baptist had announced that he felt like it should really be between a woman and her doctor, right? Like it's kind of up to them to decide like when life begins. It's not our business or whatever. But like between 78 and 80, it picks up. You see all of the old leaders of the religious right come online. they all kind of get on board because they're really frustrated with the Nixon administration first, and then Carter taking away their tax exemptions for their private schools, which is the workaround that they're using to keep schools segregated after the public schools are integrating, right? So they're very upset about that at the grade school level. And then they're also extremely concerned that the government's going to come for the tax exempt status for Christian universities, right? Like that's super, super foregrounded. And that's also like a racialized way to keep students separate. But between the grade schools and the universities, they're super worried about that, but they start talking about abortion. If you go back and read Jerry Falwell in 1978, when he talks about the figure of the child, he is talking about the child that needs to be protected from sitting next to a black student in the school. By 79, he's talking about the child in the womb, right? Like it's an amazingly fast turnaround. Like in 2 years, all of the old guard of the religious right comes online. And then funny enough, though, Bob Jones University, that's kind of like the university side of these court cases, because there's also a Green versus Connolly court case that's kind of working through the Supreme Court. The Bob Jones University case, they end up losing their tax exempt status. They have to go through a series of stalling techniques. And eventually, basically, the courts say that if you're going to be tax exempt, you have to have an integrated student body. And the one guy that dissents on the court is William Rehnquist, right? Who a few years later, Reagan elevates to to Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. So he's the guy that they go for, is like, this is our guy, right? Like the most racist, like overt theocrats racist on the court. We need to get him into power. So that was a lot of history. I could go on for that, but I think that is so fascinating, that whole background and the way that like one thing is covering the other. The Green versus Connolly, it goes by a few different names, but if anyone wants to look that up, Green versus Connolly is kind of the one to kind of chase through and know that Bob Jones University has a concurrent case that's working through the courts at the same time.
So you brought up the child, and I just can't resist talking about the Quiverfull movement. So I think this is a classic case of a movement that claims to be speaking about one thing, about the importance of family and having lots of kids, but clearly has all of these racial undertones around immigrant populations and things. And to maybe give a little context, the reason I find this so interesting, I grew up in a similar environment to you, this evangelical environment. I went to a private Christian school. And when I was in 8th grade, we went to a filming of the 500 Club. And at the 500 Club, they had one of the most prominent members of the Quiverfull movement coming in and talking about the importance of reclaiming the country by having so many children.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that movement.
Yeah, no, I think that is, sorry, I'm changing location. Let's step outside actually and enjoy my afternoon here. So the Quiverfull movement is, I think, just absolutely fascinating in the sense that they use this language like overtly, right? Like we are going to out reproduce the other, right? And they say that it's about like raising like children in a Christian home and so on and so forth. But it is definitely like a racialized script, right? Like it's not like we want everybody to reproduce as long as they like believe the same way we do, right? Like it's very clear what's going on. And I did not grow up knowing people who, like, I grew up knowing a lot of people in the Quiverfull movement. I didn't grow up in a family that was that in particular, but I did grow up like hearing a lot of people say like, the average reproduction is like 2.1 or 2.5 or whatever kids per couple. So if we just out reproduce them, we win, right? Which I think is so funny because like, obviously it assumes like a 0% apostasy rate, right? Like whatever you reproduce, like, they'll obviously kids believe whatever their parents believe, right? Yeah, but it's explicitly like the way that they kind of use language around childbearing. Okay, so first off, like Quiverfull, like what's so a quiver is for arrows, right? So like we're literally comparing children to ammunition, right, in this war, right? So heterosexuality is a weapon to be deployed against people who have like racially coded aspects to the way that we're talking about them, right, within this movement. And you get people talking about the home as like a battle station, right? Like there's a lot of war imagery in the way that they talk, right? And it's this weird world where it's highly patriarchal, but it's actually, it seems very like female led in the literature, right? Like, so the home is like very male centric still. But the literature, like it kicks off with this girl, I think her name was Mary Pride, if I remember correctly. And she wrote like, you know, the book called like The Way Home. She had this story about like growing up as a radical feminist and like deconverting from that during her 20s and being convinced that like feminism was actually deeply hurtful and that it needed to be resisted. And she's kind of looked at as like one of the figureheads of this kind of reactionary anti-feminism that's stewing in like the 70s and kind of early 80s. And then you start to have these, so like after the Christian school movement kind of comes online, the Protestant Christian school movement, at least in the 70s, in the 80s, you start to have the homeschooling movement come online. And the homeschooling movement and the Quiverfull movement are like very, very much the exact same worlds, right? So even if like a homeschool family is not quiverful, like they're probably using a lot of the same literature, or like they have like homeschool networks that will kind of work in the same region, right? So these kind of groups start to oscillate and speak to each other. And then, you know, like by like late 80s, you have like homeschooling and quiverful advocates appearing on like the Phil Donahue show and like kind of mainstreaming this stuff. You start to see the New York Times, like you know, who's always mainstreaming all of the worst things in the world, you know, kind of bringing on like to a wider readership this kind of stuff. And yeah, and I also, I guess, kind of like the last. So I discussed like, you know, homeschool in one chapter and quiverful in another, but like it's kind of hard because they're kind of like they're very much the same worlds. I do think this like homeschooling anonymous, like previous homeschooler speaking out, that whole like kind of conversation I think is kind of very interesting. And yeah, I don't know what else to really kind of say. I think of Quiverful is kind of like a very extreme version of the type of heteropatriarchy that any kind of complementarian would tell you is their ideal, right? But like what's going on there is something kind of it's in kind of like an explosive kind of in your face, like kind of exaggerated form, but like it's really not that different than basically any sort of complementarian family, kind of in the same way that we kind of mentioned like a death cult is not that much different than an apocalyptic mega church, right? Like it's just a difference of intensity. It's not a difference of drive or desire.
So at that same time period of transition you're talking about, the late 70s, early 80s, you've got a liberal evangelical president in Jimmy Carter. What would you say his place is in this whole shift?
I think that he's kind of interesting as someone who mainstreams a term and then loses all control of it, right? So if you were to like Google Ngram, where you can like search like the literature and like when certain terms like come up, search things like personal savior or like relationship with Christ, you'll see a few blips in like the 18th century, kind of late 18th century. But all of this stuff like skyrockets during like Carter's, you know, his kind of race in presidency, because like all of a sudden the mainstream media is like, as you well know, right? Like they're asking not like, should we have a born again president? They're asking, what does born again mean? Like, what do you mean you have a personal relationship with Christ? This is not like language we've heard before, right? It just wasn't mainstream language. For most of Christian history, nobody would have described themselves as having a personal relationship with Christ or like being born again. It just wasn't a thing that we did. So all of a sudden, he kind of uses this terminology and it mainstreams it. And there's a lot of other kind of, I mean, like during his administration, right, is when all these old leaders of the religious right are also kind of coming online and starting to use that language as well, and trying to kind of out Jesus the liberals, right? And so it's kind of, I think it's largely due to him. I don't want to say like singularly due, because I think sometimes he gets the story told about him where it's he calls himself a born again Christian, and like that's the only inlet that we have. But I don't want to kind of like draw that much of a like a 1-2 punch here between the two. But like I do think that there's a sense in which he uses this term, loses all control over it, and then ever after it gets bastardized so quickly with the religious right that liberals just want to run away from the term, right? And now we're kind of seeing like liberals kind of like come full circle like 40 years on, saying like, well, maybe like Pete Buttigieg, religious left or something like that. Maybe we can copy that like 40 years late, and you can't, right? Like you lost it, like He lost it by like 78, like it was gone, right? So I would say that kind of, Carter is like white. He's an evangelical in some sense, right? I want to kind of say that what I'm talking about is white evangelicalism today seems to be a distinctly different movement than like what Carter would have been as somebody who would call himself that and had a certain skin color, right? Like that, just having the evangelicalness and the whiteness is not the same as being like a white evangelical today.
Right. So part of what I was trying to get at there was that there's this notion that white evangelicalism is fundamentally oppressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Jimmy Carter seems to fly in the face of that.
Yeah.
At least in name. And so I know personally, having conversations with people who have, they may not be evangelicals themselves, but have an affinity with white evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
They always want to appeal to Jimmy Carter as one of their own now.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the good ones. He was the last great moral president, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think that, I think at some level you have to talk in generalities, right? We can talk broadly in terms of like white evangelicalism is not just being like a conservative thing, but like kind of an openly like fascist or fascist adjacent, like white supremacist movement, right? That doesn't mean that they're not like really wonderful white evangelicals that are super like progressive, right? I especially coming out of Fuller, I know a lot of them, right? We actually had a few people pop in during this conversation that would be very true about. So I don't want to say that like when I talk about it as like the most dangerous faith ever, that could be true for like 80% of them, but like not true for 19, right? Or something like that, right? But it's kind of in the same sense that like we call Democrats broadly construed liberals and conservatives broadly construed or Republicans conservatives or whatever. But there are super conservative Democrats as well, right? Like there are minority reports within this coalition. So I think that it's perfectly fine to kind of say, yes, of course there are progressive white evangelicals that appeal to Carter as at least like this good moderate centrist age kind of before the whole thing was kind of bastardized. And I don't think that there's anything inconsistent with kind of acknowledging that those kind of subsections of the sect exist, while saying, by and large, though, if you're a Jimmy Carter and you walk into a white evangelical church, you are the odd man out. You will never be accepted. You will be called a baby killer. People will not like you, and it just won't work, right?
I think you're right to point to the generational shift as well. That to a certain extent, Jimmy Carter is a white evangelical person of a previous generation. That it would be much more difficult for somebody like him to exist today with the same kind of platform that he had then.
Yeah, and also there's a massive generational shift just in the terms of like 26% I believe of boomers are white evangelicals, where only is like something like 8% of millennials, and I'm assuming it'll be about half of that with the zoomers below them, right? So there's a generational split in like how people identify. There's not been a massive change in how many white people call themselves born again, though, right? Which I think is a little bit interesting, because like, so it seems like there's a specific disaffiliation as people realize that what they call, like, it used to be the case that if you were born again Christian, you were an evangelical, right? And now it seems to be the case that actually people who have no training in this whatsoever understand that there is a difference between being a born again Christian or something like that, personal relationship with Christ, whatever you want to say it, and being a white evangelical. Those it seems to be that the broader public is actually, I think, agreeing with me and just kind of intuitively. And so like, I don't think that my claim is actually all that out there in that respect. I don't think Carter would fly with too many white evangelical churches today, right?
So at this point, we are hoping to turn a little bit more towards the future, and we've talked about you've moved in this direction a little bit earlier. So we got a question here from Jake Given, and Jake asks, "I'd like to hear you reflect on hope and despair." So I think there's a way of reading against and coming away from it pretty pessimistically. It's a fairly dark take on the present condition of Christianity, the present condition of the world. So is there a space for hope here? Should we be despairing? How should we think about this?
Yeah, like a persistent theme throughout the book is kind of like this idea that like we're running out of time, right? Like we are kind of counting down, and a lot of that has like the climate crisis and the immigration crisis like looming in the background of that. Like we really are. We have released half the carbon that we've ever put in the atmosphere in our entire species history in the last 30 years, right? Like, so like it's happened in one generation, and we are kind of like, we're about 10 years away from not being able to really stop feedback loops, right? So we need to think about those resonance machines as deeply dangerous things, by otherwise good people that have no idea that they're destroying the world around them, right? And to me, though, like I think with the climate crisis and like these kinds of crises of xenophobia that we're in, like this is like, so it is pessimistic. It is very grim, in a certain reading, right? And there are like worse climate change scenarios that I didn't even have exposure to. Yeah, I mean there are like not that out there scenarios that have us all dead like within a year or two, right? Just like I mean, usually they involve nuclear reactors and stuff like that, right? Um, but like what I'm presenting is very gloomy, but it's not even close to being like the worst case scenarios that people are talking about out there. But also like I feel like there's such a, like if there's a spiritual cause that's worth throwing ourselves in today, like this is it, right? Like this, thinking about like the interconnection, the climate, like what's it going to be like when in a world where like we're like Grandpa MAGA isn't talking about throwing up a border wall, but is instead like thinking it's crazy that I don't want to like drone strike the migrant caravans that are evacuating the entire country of Honduras, right? So like things like that, like to me, like there's a kind of a spirituality in having a mission to care about and have those conversations, and that's like I don't really believe in a caller, right? Like, but I really believe in like a calling, right? That like having these conversations and doing this research, and educating students about these types of things matters a whole lot, because at the end of the day, like if I didn't think there was any hope to make a better world, then I definitely wouldn't be thinking about having a family. I wouldn't even be interested in educating students or writing books, right? Like it just would be no point. Like why not just kind of like fuck all, make money or something like that, right? Why it seems like way easier to do, with the type of resources I have, and try to enjoy life. But no, like I think that actually I think this is one place in which I'm glad that there's a conversation, for example, about whether or not it's right to reproduce in this time, right? Especially here in the West. But I actually think that that is kind of an example of something that we need to be kind of, careful about, like in the sense of like we do need to think that if we are going to fight for the future, there needs to be people to carry on that future, right? And so we need to think about the way that we are living and the way that we are having conversations and the way that we're thinking about families and vocations and distribution of resources, assuming that there will be a future to preserve, right? So yeah, so to me, like I get the idea that like it does feel like very gloomy, and I think Jake's right to call it very gloomy, right? Um, but to me, there's also like kind of a sense of mission that comes out of that I feel is kind of exciting.
So on this point about fighting back, Matt Baker wants to know what the role or value of the hysteric might be in the context of resistance.
Yeah, I remember seeing that question, and I'm not sure that I really understand it well enough to say anything too cogent. The first thing I thought of was Jacques Lacan's 17th seminar, where he kind of frames hysteria as a way to kind of break with the logic of like what the master wants of you, right? Like it doesn't fit like into like kind of the normal capitalist machine. Um, but there's limits, I think, to thinking of that, and I'm still like, even as a psychoanalytic theorist, I'm kind of hesitant to use that word and kind of prefer to think in terms of conversion symptoms and all of that. But yeah, I don't know that I actually have like that much intelligence to say about that, to be honest. I do think that in as much as there are ways to um, uh, mock and ridicule and sort of throw back in the face the signifiers that the master gives you, which is I think what Lacan is getting at with that discussion of how like hysteria can be kind of a revolutionary position to be in. I think that's really good, right? I think like mocking capitalist and like ridiculing the people that think everything is going smoothly is actually a really important thing. I think like even just shit posting online can actually have its place, right? Like in our kind of discourse today for kind of generating differences of imagining the future at least.
So how does that that idea of shit posting of this sort of thing, how do you see that fitting with a claim you also make in the text, that the white evangelical can't be shamed as one piece, and then even more strongly can't be reasoned with, and at one point you say on in there, arguing is futile. So what is the approach that we should take in this case?
Yeah. Okay. So my claim on shame is that basically their entire world is set up to generate kind of a pseudo shame that is like more like a turmoil, right? Like constantly upset about things, constantly worried I'm not doing enough, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not like an authentic shame, right? Like when they tell you, when a Calvinist says, like, I'm a sinner saved by grace, I'm the scum of the earth, and God should hate me and obliterate me into hell, they're boasting, right? Like they're telling you that they are right and you were wrong, and you would be lucky to be more like them. And so you have that aspect of like, okay, on the one hand, like they're resistant shame, but like they're human beings, so like they feel shame, right? It's just that they don't want to feel that, and that's precisely, I think. So I explain it in one part of you. If you think of like shame and anxiety as being two opposite ends of a spectrum, shame and indifference as being two opposite ends of the spectrum. Because like if I feel shame, I don't defend myself, right? Like I shut down. I don't want to be seen. I don't want to defend my ideas, right? I just want the world to forget that I exist, right? And if I feel indifferent, I also am not defending anything, right? I'm just kind of going about my day, not thinking about anything, right? So externally, they can manifest very similarly, right? And if shame is the worst of all feelings, people do anything to avoid it. And so if they prefer to feel anxiety, or they prefer to feel like kind of indifferent about things, right? Like the white evangelical, for example, does not want to think about like destroying breathable air for future generations and saying some bullshit about like, God will come back, so it doesn't really matter, right? Like they don't want to feel like they have like destroyed the world and committed their entire life to nothing, right? So they don't want to feel shame. They would like to feel indifference, but like if you can't have either of those, like anxiety is good enough, right? Like kind of in the middle of anxiety is where you're jumping to defend yourself. You're the grandpa MAGA, like trying to harass your grandchildren and laughing at them. You're triggering the libs, as you kind of used the example earlier. You're like reading apologetics. You're trying to convince yourself that you're right. You're plugging into Fox News, that whole apparatus, right? Like that's anxiety. That's kind of like in that middle space. So I think it's kind of like this spectrum of turmoil and indifference with kind of anxiety in the middle that we kind of need to think of. And then what was the next thing that you were kind of hitting on there? Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, we were thinking about the question of argument together with the
Yeah. So like, I think that we like there was like a brief period where I was kind of interested in kind of arguing with people and having debates about ideas. I don't know anybody who thinks that works, right? It doesn't seem to be super effective. Even as a teacher, I don't focus on like arguing my students into new ideas, right? I focus on trying to present novel ways to think about something. I think about like short-circuiting defense mechanisms. I think about like novel ways that I can explain something. I don't think of myself as being like somebody who argues them into the truth. I think of myself as somebody who can be a resource, and if they want to learn something, we can talk about it, right? And I think that's like when I think about like what the role of like the public intellectual or the pastor or the artist or whatever, like your role is not to like convince people that they're wrong and they need to think something else, right? Like you're at most, this is what Lacan calls an analyst discourse, right? Analyst is not there to like give you the correct data to reorient your life. The analyst is there to kind of serve as a point of desire that can inspire you to do basically 99% of the work, right? The way that I think about this is that there are people that can be saved at this point, and I think I'm a bit of a I think that I'm trying to think. This is kind of like a way in which I think sometimes trying to think how to put this. I'm not convinced that everybody can be saved or should be saved at this point, right? Like I am very actually kind of pessimistic. I think that once you're morally kind of like what psychologists will call like moral damage sometimes, I think that once you're okay with like knowing that the climate crisis is actually real, like and more of that belief is starting to come online, and you like mock the 16-year-old climate activist in New York, right? At that point, like I'm not completely sure that I believe that you can be saved at that point. When you see children in concentration camps and think that that's funny, I'm not convinced that you can be saved at that point. And so I don't want to waste my time having like arguments with people who are really, really committed to not changing, right? But I'm very, very interested in having arguments with people who are working class and don't quite understand like something that's going on and are open to new conversations and have just never heard anything else. And so they like went with like ultra racism because they didn't really kind of like see another option out there, right? I am interested in talking to that person, right? But there are limits, and it's I don't know, some of you are pastors, and like I'm a teacher, and some of you are teachers and pastors, right? Like, and so like that there's different ways that those vocations kind of work in that mix.
You talked about what saving somebody like that might look like, and that you don't hold out very much hope for it. What would the defeat look like for you? I mean, you talked earlier about kind of opening up a space for these conversations, and just the way in which over the last year and a half, so many more people have come around to taking climate crisis seriously. Are you talking about movement building as what kind of human salvation would look like here, or what's your image of that?
Could you say more on that? I'm not quite sure I understand what you're getting at.
They can't be reasoned with, they can only be defeated. What does defeat look like?
When I have that in mind, I have like kind of like electorally on one level, but like I don't want certain ideas in the academy. I want them to be shamed when they're uttered in public. I think that that's actually a good thing to induce like a certain level of shame, right? And I say this at one point, like I think that it's really kind of interesting how white evangelicalism wants to invest shame kind of unwisely, and we kind of recoil and say that shame is never a good thing, but like maybe shame actually is kind of like a really important necessary tool. I think that that's kind of like been one lesson that at least like #resistance liberals have kind of like woken up to during the Trump administration, is like a lot of things kind of like need a dimension of shame in order to kind of like function. And white evangelicalism says that you should feel shamed because like you want to do it with other people, but like actually you feel shame for like locking immigrant children in cages and torturing them, right? Like, and that's actually kind of something I think worth feeling a bit of shame about. Not like in just a sense of guilt for activities, but like that your way of understanding the world is built around hurting people and destroying things and exerting control, and that you would defend that to the death. And if you woke up like 500 years from now, you could see into the future and you could see that Christ doesn't come back, and you see the direction that those lines of thought took you, you would feel contempt that like at your wasted commitments. Like, so I'm thinking of shame kind of like in that regard, right? Like I don't want to live in a world where like I have to be civil to people who think it's like to funny to torture children, right? Like I just don't want to live in that world. I want to mock that world. I want to shame that world. I want that to not be able to be spoken in public, and like I think that works, right? Like I don't think that that's simply putting something into a different room. I think that's a good way to kind of sideline certain perspectives and make them less viable. And this is also something that I have to deal with like as a teacher, right? Because I have like I teach a lot of like students from rural Colorado who are like MAGA all the way, and I also work at like a Hispanic serving institution, right? So sometimes I have like MAGA student next to DACA student, right? Like and I have to like you can't be neutral in that circumstance, right? Because one of the students wants to terrorize the other, and that feeling is not reciprocated. So I think we have to kind of feel like think through like that whole notion of like civility and kindness. I think kind of has its limits, and we do need to defeat certain. We do need to like blatantly say certain things are kind of off limits, and we need to push back on that. I think like especially as white people, I think that's our responsibility to do, right?
Yeah. So we've come to the end of the questions that were generated online.
Oh yeah.
I see Chris is back on the call now. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to ask here at this point? Chris is muted. There he is.
Mom?
Hey, Chris.
There he is.
Yeah. I've been listening for most of it. I'm kind of curious to your idea about election in the text, and of course there is this sort of privative connection between presidential election and Calvinistic election, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of wonder if that's why there is so much discourse and emphasis on how the legitimacy of the election.
You mean
Right.
like whether or not we want to go with Calvin's version of things, or do you have something else?
But what I mean by that is, in Trump discourse, there's this constant return to "I won," right?
Mm.
No one questions that he won it, right? We know the rules of the game, but there's always this need to justify it that is almost the cornerstone that legitimates the boasting.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's not a question, more of a...
Well, yeah, yeah. When you were saying that, I was thinking back to like the discourse, especially like sort of like earlier American Calvinist discourses around like proving one's election, right? And
That's
like
what
the
I'm...
way
Yeah.
the way that Trump
Yes.
does that is like he pulls out like an electoral college map, and then he like says something completely wrong about like how it's harder for Republicans to win, right? Like when it just and why that confuses people, of course, is like it's very difficult to kind of tell like, okay, like like we've kind of gotten to the point of understanding he's not like some sort of cynical mastermind manipulator, right? Like occasionally people will still think that, right? But for the most part, we kind of I think for the most part we understand that he's not some sort of mastermind manipulator. He's actually a stupid old game show host in an early stage of dementia, right? And that's where we're at. And he feels the need to like pull out electoral college maps, but even to him, like something like this new Ukraine thing or the Mueller thing, like that was a way to kind of delegitimize his salvation, right? And that's precisely why it needs to be mocked, right? And hashtag resistance, of course, is doing basically the same thing from the other angle, right? Of saying like, this is evidence that you weren't saved, you weren't actually elected legitimately, and you're going to lose your salvation come 2020, right? So yeah, I don't know. There seems to be something like that, but like definitely that whole appeal to make America great again, like since it's overtly white supremacist, that's all about salvation, right? Like that's exactly what that is. That's we're gonna elect people, and we changed at a precise moment, and like, oh wow, like it just happens to be like the same decades when civil rights and school integration was happening, but like that's when we lost our salvation, like in white America, right? Yeah, so I think there's got to be something like quite a bit there.
Another question is, how does Mormonism fit into this in your view? That's
I spent a lot.
I don't know
of
if you
time
talked
thinking
about that
that.
when I was...
No, I ended up just kind of leaving that to the side and not discussing whatsoever. One sort of nascent idea, and part of that's just because I don't feel qualified to engage Mormonism in the same way that I feel qualified to talk about white evangelicalism. But I did have one thing in mind kind of throughout the book that I heard an interview on, I believe it was the Homebrewed Christianity podcast years ago with a Mormon scholar. It might have been someone else, but and the scholar, she made kind of the case that Mormonism is kind of like this quintessential frontier style American religion, right? Like just like even the thing like with the big family size is like something that you get like with a like a frontier space where you like, need to have like close knit communities and stuff like that. She was kind of like essentially saying that there's it's like the American religion. And I kind of had like in the background during this book that like maybe that was true up until like Brown versus Board, civil rights, like the religious right, and then you have this like new religion emerge, right? Because like what's going on between Brown versus Board of Education and the Southern strategy kind of realignment of the parties, and then the religious right like comes to fruition in white evangelicalism and its perfected form is Trumpism today, right? Like that is the perfect apex form of an American religion. Like it's white supremacist, it's violent, it's misogynist, it's got like some Jesus window dressing to kind of keep things a little bit under wraps, but I have kind of thought of like white evangelicalism as kind of superseding Mormonism as like the quintessential like, American faith. But I honestly just don't feel like qualified enough to speak to that with the same level of authority that I could talk about white evangelicalism, unless you had like a specific
Well,
thing.
no, I'm just they're a significant voting bloc. I mean, I had this
Sure.
theory years ago that if Romney had won the 2012 election, that Mormonism would rival Pentecostalism as the predominant form of Christianity, 15 years from now. I've often wondered if Trump really wanted to make a real big impact on the world in a way that he's not already, if he converted to Mormonism, that would be a huge thing. But all that being said, that's just fantasy.
Can I actually hop in on this point?
Yeah, go ahead.
So one place where I think that this Mormonism discussion actually ties in really closely to the political work that you're looking at, Tad, is in militia movements. So I was recently really interested in the Bundyville podcast, which traces the Bundy family and then it traces it into the wider militia movement and how it's tied into white supremacy. But one thing that was really shocking there to me, because I'd never heard public discourse about this, was the important role that these sort of hyper-apocalyptic radical sects of Mormonism play in these militia movements. And there are things, for example, there's what's called the White Horse Prophecy, which was this Mormon prophecy in the 19th century that said that at a certain point there was going to be a constitutional crisis in the United States, and that at that crisis there would arise the quote unquote white horse who would come to rescue everyone. And what's his name? Edmund Bundy, I believe. I forget his first name, but the main Bundy has stated publicly that he thinks this prophecy is happening now, and his followers have explicitly stated they think he is actually the white horse. And so it's within that militia movement you seem to see the sort of Mormon version of what you are tracing in the white evangelical community.
That's terrifying. That's so great that they're just like ready, like locked and loaded, ready to kill, right? Man, wonderful. All right, very good. Yeah.
All right, so keeping in mind that we are recording this, I wanted to throw this out to Dave and to Aaron, who are both on the call at the moment. Do either of you have any questions for Tad?
Hey, Tad.
Hey, Aaron.
How you doing, man? Good seeing you.
Good seeing you too.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm maybe this is irrelevant, but all this shit's hitting the fan right now with the news and Trump's possible impeachment, and it looks like. I mean, I just glanced at my phone. The GOP the Senate's actually turning against him as well. It looks like. Any thoughts about what's going on currently? I guess with the Trump administration and the fallout, and
I think it's
how all this might relate to the universe we're discussing. I don't know.
Well, I think it's kind of like it's so great that they're gonna pretend to do this over like the stupidest thing that you could possibly go after him on, like this thing that like what he like asking like Ukraine to like investigate Biden's son. Like of course there's corruption there, like of course he was there, like but he has no reason to be like on the board of that company making $50,000 a year or something like that, right? Yeah, like so it's the stupidest possible thing to go after when you had like things like emoluments on day one, or like I don't know, various crimes against humanity that like probably or the constant efforts to maximize the number of people that we kill through healthcare policy or whatever. There's a very stupid reason to go after it. It's not going to work. But to me, I think that this is kind of like the danger that we live in, right, constantly, is what psychoanalysis calls acting out, right? Like of trying to like display oneself on the world and like pretend to be more radical than one is. And so like, why do you start impeachment hearings about like the stupidest thing possible? Probably because you don't care that much about like actually making it happen, right? But like sort of positioning oneself, I guess, in a way. And yeah, I think it would be awesome if he was kicked out and shamed, and like, you know, Pence too. That would be fantastic. I feel very skeptical. I feel like the more likely scenario is that he went the second term, right? And I could also see him getting kicked out and then winning a second term, right?
So you actually think he's going to win a second term, despite massive lack of unapproval rating?
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna make like a definitive, you know, like a prediction, but my sense is that he stands like a pretty good chance, right? He doesn't need like 50%. Those polls are lying. People will come online and come around. Like if he just ramps up the racism, we'll see those numbers kind of close back into a 50-50 zone closer to the election. And I hate that. That's terrible. Like, I mean, like we're literally talking about like the last shot that we have to hit certain climate goals, right? So it gives me no pleasure to say that. But there we are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. No, I don't. I'm sorry. I don't. I haven't actually seen like the news. All the.
I was just curious.
Well, I'm actually. I saw that there was some discussion about like the House discussion about impeachment, but I came straight here from school and just haven't caught up on everything today. That's my sense though, is that they actually don't want to remove him because most of the Democrats actually are pretty much on board with like a good 80% of what he's doing and would definitely prefer him to someone like Bernie Sanders. And there's even a good number that would prefer him to someone as conservative as Elizabeth Warren, right? So, but definitely if it was like a Sanders or Trump thing, like average Democrats going Trump every time, right? So yeah, that's the hellscape that we lived in. Right?
So, Dave, are you there? Do you have any questions? No, Dave?
No, Dave? Oh, got it. All right.
All right. So on the positive note of the hellscape in which we find ourselves, I want to thank you for coming out and encourage everyone to purchase a copy of Against What Does the White Evangelical Want? That is everyone except for David Carnish, who I am happy to report was the winner of our raffle.
All right. Congratulations. All right. Very good.
And Dave won. So thank you very much, Tad. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thanks again for setting this up. I love talking about this work, and it's meant a lot to me, and it's been really wonderful to kind of see like a lot of early feedback, and I feel like there's a lot more resonance with this than some of the previous work that I've done, and that's just meant the world to me. And I just like seeing people kind of like make some sense of their background or what's going on in the world today. So yeah, it's been tremendously exciting. I hope people know that I also have like a sort of a truncated version of this in podcast form. I'm pretty easy to find because my name is Tad DeLay and there's not many of us. But if you search on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, there's a free version that I kind of gave away in audio form so that they can get out to as many people as possible as well. Although I'd prefer you buy the book, but like whatever.
All right. Any last words, Jordan?
Nope. Thanks very much, Ted. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for setting it up.
All right. Have a great night.
All right.